Thanks, Ed. It's a tribute to the organizers that it took me so long to get up here through the crowd. More seriously, I'd like to thank Ed and that entire list right at the beginning of this celebration for the wonderful work of putting this together. I don't know how each of you who knew Phyllis felt about coming today, but I, as soon as I heard it was being planned, looked forward to the opportunity. There seemed to be something left to be done. So thank you, Ed, and all the people who put in the work and made it easy for people like me to be here. You know, it's not exactly an original line when someone passes on, especially if that someone is a friend. We are reminded pretty poignantly of our own mortality. That certainly happened with Phyllis and me. The chapter closed. That chapter is a wonderful one, but it's over. I had a little trouble dealing with that. But this isn't about me, it's about Phyllis Zlotnick. So I'd like to share with you just 3 short reminiscences that, frankly, I haven't talked about before. Those of you that have heard me repeat myself endlessly on occasion will be thankful for that. Right, Terry? How we met. Well, I'd, with respect, like to correct my good friend, Ed Burnetta. In introducing me, he suggested that I hired Phyllis. Well, that's one of those things in politics that there's a little bit of truth to it. But not enough. The fact of the matter was, is in the late 70s, a member of the Easter Seal Board of Directors, a woman from Harkness whose name I forgot, at a board meeting suggested that in addition to having a service network around the state and a lovely recreational facility in Hebron that I'm sure many of you know, that the organization should be doing more to advocate for and with persons with disabilities. That, in those days, for the Easter Seal Society, who otherwise did good work, was a foreign concept. Matter of fact, in those days, the Easter Seal Society, George, was the Easter Seal Society for crippled children and adults. So this board member said, look, we ought to set up a unit within the state office that would be an advocate for persons with disabilities and by persons with disabilities, and I've got just the person for it. And that would be this Phyllis Zlotnick, whom I'd never heard of. Well, the board passed that motion. And being a good executive director, the board passes something. In the interest of my continued gainful employment, I followed it. And I interviewed Phyllis, and there's somewhere in the reflections here, there's some notion that she was unsure as to whether that role would fit her and whether she would live up to it. Well, she lived up to it wonderfully. But she taught me something. The Easter Seal Society in those days was a trade association of sorts representing these 7 centers that were around the state. And doing things for them on an economy of scale times 1 that they'd have to replicate times 7. So it made sense. Advocacy and government relations were certainly 2 of those items, 2 of those services. And so we began a cross-training exercise, Phyllis and I. And it went something like this. I explained to Phyllis some of the ins and outs of state reimbursement, a very important matter to the centers. And she explained to me the ins and outs of a person with disabilities and what public policies needed to be changed to help those persons. I know she learned very well. I hope I did. But I remember about 2 or 3 years after she started, the drive to Jones Street in Hebron became too much for her. And one day she had to come to me and say, look, I can't do this any longer. I'd like to, but I can't. I love the work, but the distance is too great. And my disability is holding me back. I'm afraid I'm going to go off that road in a snowstorm. I'm sure there are people here that have heard that story. You know what my first reaction was? Surprise, I'd forgotten she had a disability. I said, oh yeah, that's right. There's this woman in a large wheelchair. It's pretty obvious to anybody who was looking. Somehow she made me forget. Second story deals with the years I had the privilege of serving in Washington. Since I'm the token Republican here, there's got to be one. Look, if I weren't here, you'd have to invent me. From 1981 to 86, I did work on the Hill, and Phyllis and my conversations were necessarily by telephone and not as frequent. I remember one time, though, that had implications not just for me, but for, I dare say, all Americans, and that's not too epic a statement to make. Bob Williams will remember it was during the spring of 1983, and the Vocational Rehabilitation Act amendments were before us for reauthorization, renewal, repassage, whatever you want to call it. And those reauthorization times gave people the chance to change the very bill, make improvements, hopefully, in the bill. And there were a good number of these changes, many of them controversial, Mr. Williams. Bob wrote about in our newsletter for the subcommittee. But one was particularly vexing. It occurred to me and members of my staff that with all the think tanks then sprouting up in Washington, some of them, like the Heritage Foundation, openly hostile to the interests of persons with disabilities, that what we really needed was not a group of individual voices, or as we sometimes irreverently refer to them, the Disease of the Month Club, or this disability, or that disability, or this group. What we needed was something, a think tank, a policy formation center that dealt with disabilities across the board. And so we discovered this obscure advisory group in the Department of Education called the National Council on the Handicapped. And we put together an amendment to this Vocational Rehabilitation Act to make it an independent federal agency, to take it out of the bowels of the Education Department and to task it with being the think tank for persons with disabilities as a federal agency, not outside, and cross-disability, all-inclusive. A few problems with that. One, President Reagan threatened to veto the bill over it. Two, the Department of Education, a genius at least in the field of rock and roll, but if nothing else, Bill Bennett, was adamantly opposed. More problematic for us, Bob, Senator Weiger wouldn't go along with it. His first reaction, listen, federal government's got two, excuse me, ladies, goddamn many advisory groups. We don't need another one. And I was sort of beside myself, and I called Phyllis one day, laid out a long tale of woe of how important I thought this was and why it was important. And, you know, had I lost my mind, Phyllis, I needed a reality check. What do you think? And she didn't really answer my question. You know, she said, well, John, if you don't do it, it won't get done. So we did do it. And that obscure advisory group became the National Council on the Handicapped and Disability. Within a year and a half after their founding, they published a report, so you'll remember, called Toward Independence. Toward Independence was the Americans with Disabilities. And just a few years later, Phyllis Zlotnick was nominated by the President, confirmed by the United States Senate, and took her seat alongside as an